Okay, so looking at activity 8, the primary thing to keep in mind, I think I mentioned this in the overview announcement video. The one yod's, the particular weakness there is the fact that the yod doesn't like to get squished. So in the imperfect conjugation, you have a prefix coming up against that first root letter yod, and the yod usually doesn't like that. There's some conflict that happens there. This doesn't happen in the perfect conjugation because you don't really have prefixes, at least in the count stem. And so once we get into the imperfect, the yod is going to usually do one of two things depending on what type of root we've got. And the two types of roots that Futato discussed were the true one yod, where the first root letter of this Hebrew verb has always been a yod, so that would be something like yarash here, and then what he calls the one yod vobs. These are words that historically, way back in the language, they actually used to begin with a vav instead of a yod. Over time, that vav just sort of shifted into a yod, and what happens is you will see that yod, I'm not going to say because it's not original, but that's just the association that you can keep in your mind to keep it straight. Those yods that are not original, they don't stay in the root once we conjugate it, usually, at least in the imperfect conjugation. So these two examples, one yod vav would be yalad here. The difference between these are going to be that the true one yods, the first root letter yod, is going to stay in the word. You'll still see it there. With the one yod vavs, the yod will actually disappear. And at first blush, this kind of looks like the first root letter yod is there, but this yod is not the yod of the root. This is the yod of the prefix. In Yelade, what we've got here is we've got a prefix yod. The root yod has dropped out, and all you're left with of the root are the lamed and the dalet. Now, these one yod vavs, they take a particular pattern. And again, I'm not going to say because the root yod drops out. I'm not saying that's the cause of this necessarily, but there's an association there. When that root yod drops out, you get this shift in the vowel pattern of the root. So instead of having a prefix letter and then a root one letter or first root letter, a second root letter, third root letter, you now get a prefix letter, your second root letter, and then your third root letter, and you're missing that first root in the one yod vowels. And so in order to compensate for that, what we would normally expect to find as a holum or as a patach, as our R2 letter, and again, when I say R2, I just mean second root letter, instead of a holum or a patach that we usually expect to find in our R2 letter, this is going to shift to a sere. And you can think of it, if it's helpful, as compensating for the loss. The sere here is a long vowel, and so, well, I guess Futato calls it a medium vowel, but the idea is it's not a short vowel. What we've got here is a change in the vowel length that sort of is associated with the loss of that yod. And then your prefix vowel becomes a sere, and that sort of, again, think of it as just matching the root letter here. What you're going to find is that this sere pattern is going to show up all over the place, and it is indicative generally. It's not that every time you see the sere vowel pattern, it's going to be a one yod vav in the imperfect. That's not always the case, but often this will be the clue that will indicate, it'll tip you off to, hey, if I see especially if you see a 3-letter word in Hebrew, and the vowel pattern is sere, just let that be the key, the trigger to your brain, that I might have a one yod vav cal imperfect here. That is going to be a really helpful thing if you can get it in your brain that whenever you see that sere, think one yod vav, okay? Now, the conjugation of the true one yod is a little bit different, and to me, it's a little more obvious. It stands out a little bit more. There's just something strange about these true one yods and the imperfect, or at least the cal imperfect. They kind of stick out like a sore thumb because this is the only time that we have a hirik yod as a prefix vowel. Now, of course, you don't necessarily know that at this point because you've only seen a very few number of prefix vowels. You've seen hirik for the most part. But hirik yod, this is not a common prefix vowel. And when you see a hirik yod in the prefix, or at least when you see hirik yod as the first vowel in a Hebrew word. Again, when you come across a random Hebrew word, you may not think to yourself when you see tira. At this point, you may not automatically think that this is a verb. If you just saw this in your Hebrew Bible, it could be a lot of different things. But if the first letter of a Hebrew word has a hirik yod as its vowel, just let that call up true one yod cal imperfect, and just consider that might be what you're looking at. It'll really it'll improve your parsing speed, and it'll help with not speed reading, it'll help with sight reading if you have these little clues that just kind of tip you off to what you might be looking at. So as we go through all of these, you can see pretty straightforward. We've got a hirik yod prefix vowel. That means it's a true one yod. That means yaharash is going to be our root. And of course, if we've got a yod hirik prefix, which is essentially what this is, I mean, you can either consider this, I don't know, it's technically a prefix vowel, the hirik yod, but I like to look at this. When I look at this, I like to just separate in my brain, for some reason, the yod, and there is a reason, but again, we don't need to get bogged down in the details, but for some reason, the yod here doesn't need a shavah, like we would normally see in a cal imperfect, 3ms in particular. It doesn't need a shaval like we usually see. There's a rule for that, but again, let's keep it simple. I see yod heric prefix. That immediately tells me I'm probably looking at a cal imperfect. If I take that off, I get yod resh shen, and that is a root that I've learned in my vocabulary, yodrash. Yodrash, I think, is inherit. And so if inherit is sort of the core meaning, what would that mean in the cal imperfect 3ms? And again, I know it's 3ms because I've got a yod heric prefix with no suffix. So that would mean something like he will inherit. All right, and then when you go down to number 2 here, and you're looking at this, I have kind of like a step-by-step progression that, again, the more you read, the more you get used to this, the more you develop the habit, the less you'll need these progressions. I don't actually go through this when I'm reading Hebrew, but when I was learning Hebrew, it was really helpful to kind of go step-by-step to really analyze a word to be able to parse it accurately. And so the first step is to look and see, or maybe you could say the first step is to ask yourself, if you know that you're looking at a verb, ask yourself how many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? It has 3. Now we will see hollow verbs later on. Hollow verbs, you might say, I mean, they still have 3 letters. It's just that the second letter is actually a vowel letter. So any Hebrew verb is generally going to have 3 root letters. One of them may be a vowel, but there will be 3 root letters. How many do I have here? I have 3. Well, that's good news. There are only a few situations where the conjugation of a Hebrew root actually results in 3 letters. So if I think about what those possibilities are, that could be in the perfect, that could be the cal perfect 3ms. The problem here is the vowel pattern doesn't match. If this were a cal perfect 3ms, this would be yod kametz lamed patach dalet yalad. And that's not what we have here, so it can't be cal perfect 3ms. There isn't another verbal form in the perfect conjugation that only has 3 letters. All the other conjugations, or all the other forms in the perfect conjugation have a suffix. What about the imperfect? Are there any in the imperfect that only have 3 letters? And if you're just thinking about the strong verbs, no, all of the verbs in the imperfect conjugation are going to have a prefix, which would add a letter. Well, we haven't learned infinitives or participles or anything like that yet, so what else can we make of this? Well, it must be a weak verb, and if it's a weak verb, that means we must be missing a root letter. So now we can start thinking, okay, what is added and what is missing? What are the letters that might be additional? What are the letters that might be missing? Right? I think it's easiest to start with what's added here. So we could look at this and say, do we ever add a yod to the beginning of a verb? And we do, obviously, in the cal imperfect. The 3ms and the 3mp conjugations, those both have a yod prefix. Now the difference between them is that the 3mp is going to have a shuric suffix, and this does not. So right there, we've got the information we need to parse this out as a cal imperfect 3ms form of, but of what? It's not just lamed dalet. What else could be here? Well, that's when we ask, what might be missing? Where do we tend to have letters drop out? And we're going to learn more and more of these types of verbs as we get deeper into the weak verbs, what types of letters drop out. So far, we've learned about the noon, noon doesn't really drop out, it assimilates, but you can think of that as it dropping out. It disappears, so to speak. We've also learned about the hey, at the end of a third hey, how that will sometimes disappear. Yes, and we've learned that the hey can disappear from the end, so this could be lamed dalet hey. But if this were lamed dalet hey, first of all, that's not a verb we've learned so far. And if it were lamed dalet hey, we don't have any, there's no third hey verb that we've learned where the sere pattern occurs. Now, I'm clearly belaboring, I'm going through the steps here as if you didn't just have this lesson on the 1 yods. Like, you probably know that this is from Yalad, that this is just the 1 yod vav where the first root letter yod is dropped out. But again, let's pretend like we're coming to this form in the wild. We're reading through our Hebrew Bible and we come across this. How do we get from the form we see to knowing what it is? Like, the Hebrew text isn't going to tell us, okay, we're just looking at 1 yods right now. So you've got to be able to get from this form back to what the root is. And so again, if we know that the yod is an added prefix and we take it off, we've only got 2 root letters left. One of them is missing. Is it missing from the end? Or is it missing from the beginning? Well, the only one that we've learned that can miss from the end is the hey, and we've just seen that this wouldn't make any sense. That would still have a heric prefix. And furthermore, it wouldn't be missing with no suffix. When you have a third hey verb in the imperfect, the hey isn't missing, it ends with a segel hey. So this isn't a third hey. Well, what do we miss from the beginning? Again, the 1 noon will sometimes have the noon go missing, but it assimilates as a dalet, it assimilates as a dagesh in the next letter, and we don't have that here. So this isn't a 1 noon, it's not nalad. What other weak verbs have we run into where a letter might go missing? Well, at this point, the only other one is the yod. So suppose we're missing a yod at the beginning. What verb would that make? That would make yod lamed dalet. Is that a root that we've learned? Yes, it is. Yalad. Okay, so far, that's the best explanation of this. Now, once we get into other types of weak verbs, we may have to keep digging a little bit. But at this point, the 1 yod explains what we see here. That's a long process to go through. You can short circuit that entire process if you just commit to memory, sere pattern, usually indicates a one yod in the cal imperfect. If you can connect that, then you can skip that whole process. But it is good to know that process to go through, just so you can be a little bit more methodical and make fewer mistakes. But that's the process I would go through here to parse this out. So if we've got yalad, yalad means he begat in the cal perfect 3ms. So what does it mean in the cal imperfect 3ms? Well, it would mean he will beget. And as you go through the rest of these here, I guess we do have a one Aleph here, yochal. So yochal, that's an interesting looking verb. How many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have here? I have 4. So something is extra. So what is extra? Well, do we ever add a lamed to the end of a Hebrew verb in conjugation? No, so the lamed must be part of the root. We haven't yet learned about adding anything to the middle, so these middle letters are probably safe. If we just start from the lamed and we go back till we have 3 letters, we get achal. That is a root that we've learned, so this is probably our root here. But it's a little bit strange because it doesn't have the heric prefix vowel that we're used to. Well, that's when we have to remember that there are certain one Aleph verbs in the cal imperfect that will switch from a heric prefix vowel to a holum prefix vowel. And as a result, they get this holum patach pattern. So you'll see that we have a patach in the R2 letter here. So that's just another way of kind of getting to the answer if you don't have the shortcuts memorized. But achal makes perfect sense as the root, and cal imperfect, 3ms, makes perfect sense as the conjugation once you remember that certain one Aleph verbs take a holum prefix. All right, so if this is a cal perfect 3ms and achal means he ate, then what does yochal mean? Well, yochal would mean he will eat. So you can keep going down here the rest of the way. We can see that heric yod prefix. This tells me it's a true one yod, so I've got a yod heric prefix with a shuric suffix. That's going to be 3mp. Aleph, again, I see the sere pattern, which tells me this is a one yod vav. So if I take off the Aleph prefix for 1cs and I add the yod back in, I get yalach. Oh, that's a tricky one. Yalach is not a verb in Hebrew. So there are two common verbs, I should say, in Hebrew. My Hebrew teacher referred to them as the orphan verbs. These are halach and lakach. Halach is, ordinarily you would think of it as just a regular strong verb. It does have a weak letter in that it has it's a one guttural, but one gutturals they're not super weak. It's not as much of a problem. They're not as sneaky as like a one yod or a one nun or something like that. However, there is something that happened, and again, there are morphological explanations for this, but we don't need to get in the weeds of that. The easy way to kind of remember what halach is doing is just to imagine that halach was an orphan Hebrew verb, and it got adopted into the one yod family. And so when halach conjugates, it often follows the pattern of the one yod vav, that is. And so anytime you're going through here and you parse out and you get to a root of yalach, just remember that's actually halach. That there is no verb yalach in Hebrew, at least not that I'm aware of, and that when you get to a place where you're thinking, oh, okay, one yod vav, that's actually going to be halach here. And so if halach means he went, then elech would mean I will go. All right, natati is pretty straightforward. The only thing that's irregular about this is that the nun on the end has assimilated into the suffix. So you might expect to see a nun here, but again, the assimilated nuns are relatively easy to see once you get used to them. So that's going to be cal perfect 1cs, I gave. Krat tem, this is another one that it's another assimilation verb. It might be a little bit tricky because you're not seeing as many letters as you would be used to, but this tem suffix should stick out pretty clearly to you as the cal perfect 2mp suffix. When you see tem on the end of the word, be thinking cal perfect 2mp suffix. And so if we take that off, we're just left with the kaf and the resh, and we're missing something. So what are we missing? Are we missing a hey, like a third hey verb? Well, for the third hey verbs, whenever you add a consonantal suffix, that is a suffix a suffix that begins with a consonant, the kamatz hey shifts to a heric yod, and we don't have that here. So this isn't a kamatz hey. This isn't a third hey verb, kara. Where else do we lose a letter? Well, we lose a letter in the one yod, but that's only in the imperfect, and this is the perfect conjugation, so it's not a one yod. What about a nun? We lose nuns all the time. We just lost one up here at the end of a word. We will sometimes lose a nun at the beginning of a verb if it's an imperfect and it has a prefix. And this would fit if this were kaf resh nun, karan, but karan is not a Hebrew verb I'm aware of. There are a lot of Hebrew verbs that I don't know that occur a few times in the Bible, but that's not one I'm familiar with, and it's certainly not one that you've learned thus far. So this is most likely a verb that you've learned. What else could be going on here? Well, we learned that when you have two identical Hebrew letters next to each other, those almost inevitably are going to collapse into a dagesh. And that's what you've got here, is you've got a doubled tav. Usually the tem suffix does have a dagesh, but it's usually a weak dagesh because the preceding syllable is closed. It's not usually a doubled dagesh, but here, because the root karat, because that root ends with a tav and this suffix begins with a tav, this weak dagesh actually becomes a strong dagesh to collapse both tavs into one. So this one then would be karat. I always get karat and I'm pretty sure karat means, yeah, okay, I'm not going to tell you what I get it confused with, because I don't want you to get confused. But karat, I think of carrot, not carrot like, I guess that works too. You can think of it like a carrot that you eat, or I should say that you cut, that you chop. Or karat, I think of like a carat of a diamond, like a diamond has so many carats in weight, and so I associate that with the cut of the diamond. I know that the cut of a diamond and the weight of the diamond are not related, but that's my association. So, if you have a better one, put it in the Hebrew vocabulary spreadsheet. But so karat would be he cut. If karat is he cut, then karat tem would be you all masculine plural cut. Well, okay. So he's saying he associates this with the cutting of animals in two, and this is true. That happened. I don't know that that is necessarily why. I'm not sure that's why they use karat though. Like, think of it this way. I don't know if people still talk like this today, but in English you might use the phrase to cut a deal. So to cut a deal means to make a deal. You're not actually cutting anything there. So I don't know that this tradition of the animals being cut in two, that was not part of every covenant, I don't think. So anyways, karat, if you translate it make a covenant, then I'm fine with that. So I didn't mean to get distracted there, but let's go back here. All right, so karat tem, that's going to be you all cut. And then natse, there we've got the seri seri pattern again. So I'm thinking that this is a one yod vav. So if I take off the noon prefix, which is the 1CP, cal imperfect prefix, and I put a yod in there, I get yatsa, which is a verb that I've learned. Yatsa, I think of Yahtzee, the game, so I think of the dice coming forth or coming out of the barrel, I suppose. So yatsa, to go forth, to come forth, something like that, to go out. So this would be we will go out. Next one, again, Hirik Yod prefix. Like, eventually you're just going to see these and you're going to know instantly what you're looking at. So I see the Hirik Yod prefix vowel. That tells me true one Yod. So I know that Yara is my root. This Tav prefix, when I have a Tav prefix with no suffix, that's either going to be 3FS cal imperfect or 2MS cal imperfect. And again, context will have to determine what it is there. But if Yara is he was afraid or he is afraid, then Tira would either be she will fear or she will be afraid, or you, masculine singular, will be afraid, something like that. And then yitain here, this is another one where natan is just a weird verb. It's certainly doubly weak. The initial noon and the final noon, those all kinds of weird things can happen. You'll see one form. Oh, I think I actually explained exactly morphologically what's happening here in a previous session. Let's go ahead and do that. So you've got natan, usually looks like this. Noon kametz tav patach noon. And what happens is you add the yod hirik prefix to natan, and you get yin ton. The problem is that noon will now have a shavah, just like you're used to seeing a shavah in the first root letter of a cal imperfect verb. But anytime you have a noon shavah, where that shavah is silent, in other words, anytime a noon closes a syllable in Hebrew, and the next... Anytime a noon closes a syllable before the end of a word, like if it closes, like natan here, it's closing a syllable, but there's nothing after the noon in the same word. Anytime that noon is sandwiched by closing a syllable and then you've got a consonant right after it, that's when you get the assimilation. Now, I'll point out, so we do this assimilation thing in English as well. So we have this prefix in, and in usually just means not. So we might say involuntary, we might say ineffective, we might say inefficient, something like that. And all of these mean not efficient, etc., right? But we also have words like, well, actually we don't have words like illegal or immoral or irregular. We don't have words like this. It's not a coincidence that these changes occur with the in prefix. The phonology of the sound that we call n or n, that particular sound, what it does in Hebrew, it also does in English. When we mix that with particular other sounds in English, the n is going to assimilate into the same sound as whatever follows it. And that's essentially what you have going on in the assimilation of the noon to the following letter. It's a phonetic sort of thing. And so that's something that happens in English as well. It's not just because Hebrew's weird, it's something that we see in our own language. So you may have never noticed that before, but hopefully that helps make more sense of what's going on with noon assimilation. And so because that noon that was beginning the word is now closing a syllable when we add the yod hirik to it, it is now squished between the yod and the tav, so it is going to hide inside of the tav as the dagesh, and we get yitain here. Now, some of the noon letters, some of the noon forms, the noon word, oh my goodness, some of the natan words, conjugations, are so unrecognizable, that it's often a good idea just to memorize the different forms of natan. So this word here, tate, this is a form of natan. I think this is actually the infinitive construct form, which we'll get to at a certain point. But it's like, what do you even have there? Like, the only remaining letter that you have of natan is the tav. So some of these are just so changed that they're impossible to parse back. You just kind of have to memorize them. Now, there's an explanation for why you go from, for example, natan to tate. I mean, there's an example for the morphology here of why this changes. But if you just see tate and you haven't memorized that tate is the infinitive construct form of natan, it's going to take you forever to get back to natan. So all that to say, being able to parse, being able to understand the morphological changes that happen with these verbs is going to be very helpful for when you come across verbs that you haven't learned the forms of yet. You know, you're only learning, I think Futato teaches you maybe 400 or so words in this first year. Like, and those are not all verbs. I mean, there are thousands of words in the Hebrew Old Testament. So you're going to come across words that you haven't seen before. And knowing these morphological rules of what happens to the letters and everything are helpful in those situations. But sometimes it's easiest to just memorize forms. And I would say that natan is one of those examples. All right, focus on weak roots. When it comes to translation, obviously, the translations are available in the back of the book. So what I'll do is I'll just go through here and point out what I see. What are the clues that I see that help me parse this out? So this first one, I immediately notice a prefix holum. Next to an aleph, that tells me that this is amar. This is my root. I know this is a one aleph verb. Amar makes perfect sense. Yod prefix, shurek suffix, that's going to be the count imperfect 3MP. Number two, I see the seri seri, so I immediately know this is a one yod vav. So yashav is my root with a tav prefix, no suffix. That's going to be either 3fs or 2ms in the cal imperfect. Now, number three is a little trickier because I don't have the seri seri pattern. I have a seri patach. But the reason why it goes seri patach is because my third root letter is a guttural. And gutturals, especially ayin and chet, have a strong preference for the patach over an E-class vowel. So what happens here, and that has to do kind of with where these letters are sounded. The chet is obviously in the back of the throat, and I know we say that ayin is silent. It's not really silent. It's just that we can't hear it. We don't hear the ayin. I think in modern Hebrew it probably sounds the same as aleph. And you might say, well, doesn't that mean it's silent? Well, the aleph isn't silent either. Again, we just don't think of the sound that the aleph makes as a sound. We think of it as a lack of sound. But if you take, for example, the expression uh-oh, there's a sound between the and the o, and that sound is that's called a glottal stop. Basically what that means is there's part of your throat that's called a glottis, and that glottis closes off the air that's trying to pass through your throat. And when you release the glottis to let air pass through, it's kind of like releasing your lips in the p sound. When we say p, obviously p is a letter, it is a sound, but we don't think of the glottis releasing air as a particular sound. It's just that p is articulated on the lips, and so it's called a labial plosive. P. If we stop the air not with our lips, but with our teeth, that's a dental plosive, that's a T, and if we stop it with our what would that be? Basically against our palate, I guess. Then we get something like k. But it's the same thing as That's the ayin sound or the aleph sound. And so they're not really silent. It's just we don't think of them as sounds because we don't really use them in words. Talk about a tangent. So anyways, the point is that because those sounds are made way back in the throat, the a sounds are also way back in your throat, and that's why the ayin and the chet in particular have a strong preference for that a. So when we see ne da, or you might say ne da, however you pronounce the patach here, what you need to know is that this is the cousin of the seri seri pattern. It's only seri patach because you've got an ayin here. That should still tell you one yod vav, which means you take the noon prefix off, which tells you cal imperfect 1 CP. I love how you get the entire parsing of a verb just from the prefix letter. Now, tav is a little trickier, there's more options. But that is, again, if you can get to the point where you recognize, okay, noon, that automatically, noon tells me, again, we will see other functions of noon prefixes coming up, but so far, noon tells you that it's cal imperfect 1 CP. What more could you want? That's a great key to have in your mind. And then when I take that off, I get yada, which is a verb that I've learned. Yada is he knew. So neda would be we will know. Continuing on, natati, I think we basically saw that up here. Yeah, natati, it's the exact same. So again, cal perfect 1 CS, I gave. Number 5, again, hirik yod, that tells me that the yod is part of the root. So yara, yod, hirik prefix. Ir, rosh, I should say rosh, hirik yod, prefix vowel. So that tells me aleph is the prefix letter. Yod, resh, shen is my root. Now again, we don't have sere sere here, but that's because the addition of a vocalic suffix. By vocalic suffix, I mean a suffix that is a vowel. That adds a new syllable to the word, and that forces the syllabification to shift in the Hebrew word. And so what happens here is the second root letter, the theme vowel, the R2 vowel, whatever you refer to this as, this now has to reduce. So it goes from sere to vocal shava. You get yetsu. All right, number 8, Hirik Yod prefix vowel. So again, yara, this is going to be our root. Hirik Yod prefix vowel, yavash. Sere sere, 1 Yod vav. So this is going to be yalad. Karat ta, again, this is the tav collapsing into the strong dagesh here. Tochal, again, that holam Aleph combination here, that lets me know that the tav is the prefix. This is a cal imperfect, and because I have no suffix, it's either 3fs or 2ms, or sorry, yeah, 3fs or 2ms, correct. Natatem, again, we've got the dagesh for assimilation. Omar, this one is probably your trickiest one, okay? So let's look at this, because Omar, it's another 3-letter one, which my first impulse when I see this is to think perfect conjugation, just because I think no prefix, no suffix. But there is a prefix. It's just confusing. So what happens here in the 1CS form of these 1-Alephs that take a holam prefix is that the Aleph itself, Hebrew doesn't want to have Aleph holam Aleph shava, or Aleph holam, it doesn't want that mess. The root Aleph is going to drop off. Okay, this is not the Aleph of the root. If it were, this would be closer to a participle, which we'll learn about later, but this is the prefix Aleph. The holam here tells us that this is a prefix vowel. Now that I mentioned participles, I'm not going to explain all that right now, but this is the Aleph here is the prefix letter, 1CS. The holam here is the prefix vowel, and the root Aleph has dropped out. Again, that root Aleph dropping out, that will only happen in the 1CS form, in the cal imperfect. But you can see that it's imperfect because you've got the patach, you've got a prefix plus the patach. Well, let's just think of it as the holam patach pattern, where we saw that above in tochal. Again, it was holam patach. Where else do we see that holam? Up here, again, if this were singular, it would be yomar with a patach here. But because we've added a syllable, we now have to reduce that middle syllable. And then, again, yochal. So again, holam patach. When you see that holam patach pattern, that should be an indication to you that you're looking at a cal imperfect of the 1-Aleph flavor. All right, any questions on B there?
I'm all good there, thank you.
All right, let's see C, and then we skip D. So C, all right, this is the fun stuff, possessive suffixes. All right, so again, we learned the possessive suffixes on singular nouns last semester, and now we find out that if it's a possessive noun, all of a sudden the suffixes look a little bit different. I actually prefer the way that Miles Van Pelt presents this. He presents it as type 1 suffixes and type 2 suffixes. And what he says is that singular nouns take the type 1 possessive suffix. Again, possessive suffix, he doesn't call them possessive suffixes. He would say that singular nouns take the type 1 pronominal suffixes. Pronominal just means pronoun. And that plural nouns will take the type 2. Well, if singular take type 1 and plural take type 2, then why not just call them singular and plural? Well, one, it confuses the number of the noun with the number of the pronoun, and you don't want to confuse that. Secondly, you will see that certain prepositions will take as their object type 1 pronouns, and other prepositions will take as their object type 2. That doesn't mean some pronouns are singular, or I'm sorry, that doesn't mean some prepositions are singular and some are plural. It just means that there are two different sets of pronoun suffixes. And singular nouns take the first set, type 1. Plural nouns take the second set, or the second type. All right, so when you see a yod, with one exception, and this is it, you can be confident that you've got a plural noun, okay? This is the exception. Hirik yod is the 1CS suffix for a singular noun. If this noun were plural, it would be patach yod. That's the one exception. But everywhere else, if you don't see a yod, it's almost certainly singular. If you do see a yod, it's almost certainly plural. And by it, I mean the noun. So here, we don't see a yod in the suffix, so this is probably a singular noun. And holam vav, well, the vav here usually indicates the third masculine singular suffix. So I don't really need to even remember that holam vav is one suffix and patach yod vav is the type 2 suffix. All I need to do is I need to see the vav, which I associate with 3ms, because in type 1 it's holam vav, type 2 it's patach yod vav, but it's vav in both. So I just associate the vav with 3ms. And I don't have a yod here, so that tells me that the noun is singular. So this would be his king. The next one here, again, I see Comet's hay. I associate the hay with third feminine singular. I don't see a yod, so this means king is singular. So this would be her king. This next one, Malchenu. Here I see the nu suffix, which I always associate with anachnu, which is we, 1CP. So this would be our. I don't see a yod, so it's not our kings, it's our king. Number 5, Malcham. Again, this mem I associate with third masculine plural. So this would be their, not kings, because there's no yod here, their king. Number 6, I see the kaf kametz. Kaf kametz is 2ms. So this would be you, masculine singular, your, not kings, because there's no yod here, so it would be your king. Malach kem, the kaf segel mem, whether it's type 1 or type 2, kaf segel mem is going to be second masculine plural. So this is, again, you, masculine plural, not your kings, because there's no yod, your king. Malkeich, malkeich, the kaf shava, that is 2fs. So kaf kametz, 2ms, kaf shava, 2fs. And so here, malkeich, this is going to be your feminine singular, not kings, because there's no yod, your king. And malkechein, kaf segel nun, that is 2fp, so it's been your king. And then malkan, the nun, is third feminine plural. So this is going to be their feminine plural, king. But again, all of these, king is singular because there is no yod before the prefix here, or part of the prefix. I would love to turn to some that have the... I guess, okay, the reason why we don't have the plurals is because you haven't learned it at this point. He's just kind of preparing you for lesson 19, where you will learn the plural forms. So let's just jump there. Let's jump to lesson 19 now. I know that this is what you're currently working on, exercises, but let's just go ahead and take a look at some of these. You see here, these are all plural nouns because they all have a yod. So when you see that yod, and again here, this is the tricky one, the 1CS is tricky. If this were my horse, singular, it would be hirik yod. But since it's patak yod, this is my horses. But every one of them here has that yod. And this is an important point to make as well. The feminine plural will still have the ot ending. In addition to the ot ending, will have the sere yod part of that suffix. So let's just take nafshot. Nafshotecha, this is the syllable that would be accented here. Nafshotecha, this here is going to add the sere yod. This is a little bit confusing because he says in lesson 19 that the sere yod is actually... Maybe he says it's related to the masculine plural construct suffix sere yod, which, yeah, I think that's true, it is related, but that gets confusing when you start seeing it on feminine plural words. But again, the idea here is because you've got that sere yod, it's really obvious that soul is souls here. It's really obvious that this is plural because you see the whole involved tav, and that tells you plural. But don't forget that this sere yod is also connected to the number of the noun. This is not connected to the number of the suffix. All right, you're going to see the sere yod even on singular suffixes like... For example, maybe you won't see sere yod, but you will see a yod. I think the closest would be echa, and I don't see echa here. So, but yeah, the point, boil it down, what I want you to see here is that these are all plural because each one has that yod in the suffix. All right, and so again, you please do memorize that. I guess here kametz. I think before I said patach, that may have. I'm not sure, that may be unique to this form. Maybe not, because here's kametz as well. Am I just crazy? Maybe I'm mixing the patach yod with kametz yod vav. Okay, so apparently it's kametz yod vav and not patak yod vav. But yeah, you're more than welcome to memorize kametz yod vav as the 3ms suffix for plural nouns. But if you just memorize vav as 3ms, it's kind of a shortcut, okay? And I'm not telling you to cut corners. I'm saying use it as training wheel. And, get the most essential information first, and then once you've got that nailed, now you can add nuance to it. So again, remember that vav is 3ms. Chem is 2MP, nu is 1CP, hem is 3MP, cha, that's 2MS, I is 3MS, eich, that's 2FS, ha, that's 3FS, chem, hem, all of these we've seen. So again, you can take that essential portion of the suffix that's common to both type 1 and type 2 to kind of associate the parsing of the pronoun, and then consider whether there's a yod in the suffix or not. If there's a yod, then the noun is plural. All right, so let's take a look at number 4 here, and I will just kind of use this to block and make any notes that I need to. So, yetsu, I don't have a sere pattern here, but I do have a sere prefix, and at this point, sere prefix val is enough to clue you off to, hey, maybe this is the 1 yod vav cal imperfect, third person in particular. Now, if it's got a shurik suffix, that's 3MP. But this yetsu tells me that yod is my R1 letter, so yatsa, and then this yod prefix with shurik suffix tells me that I've got the 3MP version. So I'm just going to write that gloss. Again, this is just a gloss. I'm in stage 1 of translation, which is analyze the Hebrew words. So this first word I'm going to analyze as, I'm going to call it cal imperfect. It is 3MP. It is from yatsa, which I will just, where are we? Oh, it's going to do the other side, so let me go over here. There we go. Of yatsa. Now, yatsa means, oh boy, this is going to get annoying. Yatsa means came. Yatsa in the count imperfect 3MP is going to be they will come forth or come out. All right, and then that's probably my main verb because it begins the sentence. And when I've got my main verb, especially if it's a third person, I'm going to look for the next word to be my subject. So I'm going to need a noun that matches the gender and number of the verb. And right now the gender and number is masculine plural. So I'm looking for a noun that's masculine plural. And sure enough, I get ha'anashim. Anashim, hirik, I don't know why my hirik is missing here, but hirik yod mem tells me that's masculine plural. So this anashim is actually, well, it means men. Ha'anashim is men, the men. We've got the hey kametz definite article here. So the men is probably my subject. Okay, this is probably my main verb. So my next word, ha'ela, I see the hey kametz, this is my definite article. If I take that off, I get ela, and ela is the near demonstrative in the plural. So the near demonstrative in the plural would be these, and because it has the article, these is, by the way, I say masculine plural. It could be feminine, but it's plural. So because it has the article, it's probably functioning attributively, which means perhaps it comes after its noun. And since it agrees with its noun indefiniteness, we confirm that it's functioning attributively. So it's not the men, the these. It would be something like these men, okay? These men would then probably be my subject of will come forth or will go out. All right, so then I get, so my next kind of phrase here, me'ir hamelech. This is a lot. I kind of recognize hamelech, that's sort of straightforward. Me'ir, if I look closely, I can see ir in here. But then I've got this mem sere prefix. Now, when do I prefix something to a noun? Well, the definite article is one situation, but this is not the definite article. I also prefix prepositions to nouns. And this does happen to be a preposition. It's just a form that we're not used to. This is the min preposition. And when it gets prefixed to a noun, it will often, when it gets prefixed to a noun without the article, it will often assimilate the noon into the next letter. But of course, the ayin being a guttural, it can't take a dagesh, so the noon doesn't assimilate. The noon just drops out. And as a result, the hirik of the men is going to lengthen to a sere, and so you get me'ir instead of min-ir. So min-ir is going to be something like from, and then we've got city or town. And we could say from a town or city if we knew this was indefinite. You might say, well, it is indefinite. It doesn't have the article. True, but the article is only one way that we know that a noun is definite. A noun is definite if it has the definite article. A noun is definite if it is a proper noun. And a noun is definite if it has a possessive suffix. None of those apply to this, but a noun could also be definite if it is in construct with a definite noun, because the definiteness of the construct depends on the definiteness of its absolute. And here we see that ir is in construct via the makef. It is in construct with hamelech, which has the article, which is definite. And so this would be from the city or town of, because it's construct, and then we have the king. All right, and then our next word, our final word here, ha-gadol. Ha-gadol, this is going to be definite article, the, and then, so if we take off the hey, patak, dagesh, we get gadol, which we know as an adjective. Gadol being, well, it could be large, or it might just be great, okay? We'll stick with those two. And then we'll talk about how context influences our translation here. So gadol can mean large, it can mean great. Now we notice that gadol being an adjective, it does have the definite article, which means it's probably in an attributive relationship with a noun, and the definite article of the noun matches the definite article of the adjective. And so we confirm that attributive relationship. So this is not the king, the great. This is the great king. All right, well, we've now analyzed pretty fully this. Let's go one layer deeper in analyzing this. We've analyzed the grammar here. Let's analyze the function of all of these words. So we've already talked about how yatsa is probably the main verb, and then we have ha'anashim, that is probably the subject of the main verb. We know that nouns can perform a few different functions. One of those is subject, and that seems to match here. Ha'ela is an adjective functioning attributively. We already talked about that. And then we have the preposition min. How is this preposition functioning? Well, min is functioning to modify the verb. Okay, min is modifying the verb. It's describing in what way they came forth. It's adding detail to the action of the verb. So they came, or they will come forth. In what way will they come forth? They will come forth from the city of the king. And again, here, ir, this is a noun. Nouns can function as the subject of the verb, but they can also function as the object of a preposition. And here, min is describing the relationship between the men coming forth and the city, and that relationship is an ablative one. They are separating. The men are, by way of coming forth, are separating from the city. Here we've got Hamelech. So what is the function of Hamelech here? Well, again, it's a noun. So a noun can function as the subject. It can function as the object of a preposition or the object of a verb. It can also function as the absolute of a construct chain. And that can be either description or possession or something like that. So here, is it the city belonging to the king, or is it the city characterized by kingness? Well, it's probably makes more sense to call it the city that belongs to the king, the king's own city. Okay, so here Hamelech is the absolute in a construct chain that is describing possession in a sense. And then Hagadol, how is this functioning? This again is an adjective that's functioning attributively to Hamelech, so it describes the king as the great king. Okay, now we've analyzed pretty thoroughly all of these words. We've described their functions. Now we have to ask, stage 2, English, how do you build this sentence? We've seen how Hebrew builds it. Now we have to ask English, how do you build this sentence? So English, when you build a sentence, what do you want first? English says, give me the subject first. All right, what was the subject? We come back through here. The subject was the men. All right, the men. And now we also saw that the men was modified by these. Okay, so instead of the men, these, and instead of these men, we're just going to, in English, we don't use that article with a demonstrative. We're just going to say these men. All right, English, you've got your subject. What do you want after your subject? English says, after the subject, give me the main verb. So we come back through here and we say, okay, what was our main verb? They will come forth, or they will come out. So these men will come out. And again, remember, they is not a word in the Hebrew text here. Yatsa literally means will come forth or will come out. It implies that the subject is masculine plural, but there is no word they here that we would bring into English. We only supply that pronoun in English if we don't have an explicit subject in the sentence in Hebrew. These men will come out. English, what do you want after the main verb? English will say, give me the direct object. Okay, well, come out, yatsa, this is an intransitive verb in Hebrew. It doesn't take a direct object, and so we don't have a direct object here. English, what do you want after the direct object? Give me the indirect object. Well, again, if it's intransitive, it doesn't have an indirect object either. So then you can say, okay, we don't have a direct object, we don't have an indirect object. What do you want after your verb now, English? English would basically say, give me anything that modifies the verb. So the first thing we want that modifies the verb would be the direct object. The second thing that we would want would be the indirect object. Not having either of those, we're now looking for probably, in this situation, prepositional phrases or adverbial phrases that modify the verb. So Menir or Meir Hamelech was from the city of the king, the great one. Well, this is a lot. The prepositional phrase is really Meir, which would be from the city. But you can see in Hebrew that this is inextricably bound with Hamelech, which is bound with Hagadol. So we have to kind of add here this phrase altogether, the city of the great king. These men will come out from the city of the great king. All right, so when we go down here and we check, these men will go out. Same thing. The idea of coming out or going out, same thing. In Hebrew, you can use this verb for either one. From the great king's city. Now, he translated this where it's more explicitly possession as opposed to description. Again, construct, two very common uses of construct. Possession is probably the most frequent, I would guess, but description is another very frequent use of construct. He's making it explicit. He's explicitly interpreting this as possession. And again, we can intuit in English that city of the great king, that refers to possession. But to make it explicitly possession, we could say, these men will come out from the great king's city. That is obviously possession. That's what the apostrophe S is doing here, is signifying possession. So, anyways. All right, well, that's the translations there. Hopefully that's helpful for you. You've also got these Bible translations here. Again, the answers you will find in your... just do these phrases here are not really that helpful, I think. I would go ahead and just do a whole verse, but we're quite a bit into the conference here, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. About an hour and a half in, so that's a good time to call it quits here. If you have any questions, send them my way. Hope you're having a great week. Take care.